Welcome to Biblioccultus, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. In this episode, I'm going to go over a book called Design for Destiny by Edward Russell. So before I begin, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. All these things really help the channel out to grow. So if you like what I'm doing here and you want to support the channel, do these little things and it will really help out. So Design for Destiny by Edward Russell. The edition that I have is an original edition from 1971 and the publisher is Neville Spearman. Now, before I go into the basics of the book, this particular book is part of a very interesting phenomena that was quite common in the 60s and 70s, and this is the reason that I think it's a crucial book to read, because it will give you a nice window into a particular consciousness at the time. This is a very revolutionary moment in thought and in scientific inquiry, and very experimental, which I think is a good thing in the scientific experience. So this type of book explored consciousness, existence, evolution from very creative angles. So obviously when I review a book, I am limited within the parameters of the book. So I am very aware that there will be plenty of current or recent discoveries or scientific theories that will go contrary to this book. But the point of reviewing this book is the impact that it had in the thought of many people. And it also reflects the history of how these ideas were discussed, because it combines a lot of strange notions into one single theory. And that to me is what calls my attention. Scientific theories ebb and flow. I did a book on a critique of evolution, and you had people show up. They were basically almost religious fanatics in favor of an evolutionary theory that in reality most people don't follow anymore. As laymen, we get information on current theories pretty late in the game. I mean, most people started talking about the speed of light and of Einstein's theory of relativity decades later. It became part of the consciousness of the populace in general much later. But the same happened with Darwinism and then neo-Darwinism, and because secular society has abandoned religion as its main source of conceptions, of presuppositions, of axioms, of intellectual justification, and has assumed science to be its new religious dogmatic foundation, then any moment you question these things, you get the same reaction that you would get if you were questioning a dogma of a particular church. So just keep in mind that I am limited to the book. If you ever have an alternative book that presents a different theory, suggest it to me. But you will notice that I will review books on topics that are either older, on theories that may not be accepted anymore, and sometimes I will review books on scientific theories that are quite current, that will probably be debunked 20 years later. So you have to give a book reviewer some flexibility in that, because as a book reviewer, I am limited to the content of the book, of course. So, like I mentioned, this work by Edward Russell gives the basic premise that all living beings are controlled by an electromagnetic field, and that this electromagnetic field is the organizing mechanism that keeps all living beings in a particular shape, that builds and repairs with varied materials, but that since molecules don't seem to have the ability to self-correct because they're complex and they seem to be forever falling apart, which is entropy, then the question is, how do they rebuild themselves? And the answer that the book gives would be the L fields, the life fields. In the life fields, just for the sake of informing those that are listening, is a theory by Harold Saxton Burr in the 1930s, around about 30s and 40s, in which he postulated electromagnetic fields that influenced evolution, organized evolution, etc. And by the way, these electromagnetic fields, these L fields, were impersonal. So even though some people have accepted, including this book, the L fields as a manifestation of God, if you will, at the end of the day, the L fields are impersonal, which makes it even more interesting because it reflects a scientific perspective that there is something impersonal that is not God that influences evolution, which is actually giving a consciousness to evolution. It's trying to resolve a conflict, because the classic Darwinian evolutionary theory presupposes some kind of randomness, but at the same time, it is incoherent with the notion of an evolution that is led or directed with a purpose to either survive or adapt, which implies a direction or an adaptation based on a consciousness level. The L fields seem to be doing the same thing, but they're impersonal, so it's a very interesting way of trying to go around that issue. As a side note, modern science attributes these phenomena to biochemical functions like DNA and things like this. So although it admits that electromagnetism does influence molecules and can shape them, etc., I would say that probably modern scientific points of view would say, well, we know that molecules can be altered by biochemical influence, and therefore this whole L fields thing is nonsense. Fine. But the book's perspective is that the electromagnetic fields are actually a lot more important. And this had a real impact on a lot of occultists that came after, like in the 60s and 70s, that were influenced by a lot of these theories. Now, this book is from the 70s, so it's right there at the cusp of a lot of people assuming this to be correct. And again, it could have some factor of correct. I'm not a scientist, so I wouldn't be able to really make a declaration like that. I'm just saying the influence it had on kind of consciousness exploring occultists, it's quite clear because it gave a scientific explanation to an esoteric theory that had been going around since the Rosicrucian manifestos. And the book obviously uses examples like electricity or voltage altering seed production and plant growth and ovulation in women, etc. So it uses the electromagnetic field theory to kind of anchor almost every other dynamic of biological experience. One reason this is interesting is because of the electric universe theory, which I've always found so fascinating. And I'll put something right under here about it, but just the idea that the universe is really not controlled by gravity of any sort, but it's really electromagnetic fields, has always been fascinating. Again, I like thinking of different ways of approaching a lot of these notions just because I think, if anything, they help the scientific community to advance, because it is actually wild theory propositions and experimentation that advance science. Without these things, what you have is a lab coat that has replaced a priestly garb. The book is clearly pro-evolution, so it assumes evolution is true. It is simply discussing the mechanisms that help that evolution. So it holds, for example, that Adam and Eve were apes, or in the shape of apes, and that they were upgraded by L fields. And it's interesting because it says L fields from somewhere, which obviously has a lot of complicated issues with that, because where are they coming from? Aren't they already here? And why are they upgrading an ape if the L fields have no actual consciousness? It would seem that it'll be random maybe, but if it's random, why would it shape in a particular way? In other words, what's the point of sustaining the ape form or modifying the ape form if at the end of the day it doesn't matter, because it doesn't have a consciousness, it doesn't have a preference, it doesn't have an aesthetic inclination? Then modifying an ape form for a so-called refined form doesn't make any sense to me. And this is why usually the God topic comes in, because if you're trying to argue that something is progressively moving in a particular direction, it does require some form of consciousness, at least in my opinion. So once you go to the impersonal explanation, it tends to break down. Of course, one of the elements that is interesting of the book is that it hybridizes Darwinian evolutionary theory with kind of wild speculations on the notions of consciousness that were pretty prevalent in the 60s. So, for example, he posits that the body evolves independently and not concurrently with the mind. So the mind and the body are kind of evolving separately. They're both evolving, but because they're disjointed, it would seem it would contradict some basic premises of classic Darwinian evolution, because it doesn't seem to justify what is that difference or what is that distinction between one and the other. I'll read out a quote because I think it's fascinating when it comes to this very unique point in time in which you had these ideas kind of floating around and combining and creating new things. Quote,
"Since, therefore, the purpose of life is to develop individuality, we cannot expect to fulfill it only by easy or pleasant experiences. After all, in her experiments with other living forms, nature subjects them to ruthless competition and often harsh environment and conditions. She has established the rule of tooth and claw, and as the cigarette advertisements used to put it, nature in the raw is seldom mild. Similarly, the human entity could not develop in a utopian environment of perpetual sweetness and light which offered no tests or challenges."
End of quote. So that is, classic social Darwinism, because it goes on to speak of our existence as University of Earth. It is positing this idea that life is a test, similar to the Islamic conception of what creation is and why we're here, but it combines it with the Darwinian conception of tooth and claw, might is right, survival of the fittest. It's kind of putting it together in a very interesting way, because remember, he said that the purpose is developing individuality. Now, that is a very Masonic, occultist point of view that is being inserted into this Darwinian conception. But again, if you do have a purpose of individuation, of developing the individual, and if that is the purpose of nature, of existence, then that's a metaphysical claim. It's not a scientific claim. And as a metaphysical claim, it is jumping into the realm of philosophy. So again, it's very interesting because you have this combination of evolutionary theory, social Darwinism, exotic electric universe model theory, and then you have this consciousness concept of individuality and personal development that also kind of comes out of left field. And it goes even further because it actually advocates for reincarnation as a way of explaining our existence in this university of life. So now it brings the Eastern conception to simplify, because obviously reincarnation was believed across the globe. It's not like an Eastern thing, but to simplify, he's bringing in an Eastern conception. At least that's the way it was viewed in the 70s. He's bringing it in and combining it now with social Darwinism as well, and with the electric universe, and with conceptions of consciousness. So now reincarnation is the way that these elf fields keep evolving beings towards some kind of destiny that is not clearly explained. Where does it come from and why does it exist? So very interesting combination of all these ideas. And I think that to me is the most fascinating about these kinds of books, because it gives you a very creative way of looking at things. So it's stimulating, but at the same time, it's fascinating to look into how people were trying to figure these things out. And obviously, being a creature of the time, is very critical of the Abrahamic conceptions of sin and punishment. That's one of the reasons it advocates for reincarnation, because it sees it as just. And this is a classic argument against, traditional normative Abrahamic conceptions of existence, life, meaning, etc. And of course, finally, one of the elements that dominates the book is the idea of free will. And it actually gives an example of how if there is a God and he knows everything you're going to do, isn't that affecting free will? And he gives the example, no, God has foreknowledge of all the possibilities you can choose and all the consequences of what you can choose. And you just choose things and he knows what's going to happen. And he may involve himself in altering things around that choice that you made to make the effect to be less impactful, but that doesn't affect free will. And that is a classic scholastic theological position. And even the example that he gives, it's quite clearly stemming from a Catholic point of view. So I always find that fascinating because the entire book seems to be a knock on traditional Christianity, but at the end of the day, most of the axioms stem from Christianity, which I always find interesting. So hopefully you found this review interesting. Like I said, doesn't matter the edition that you get, and I think you'll find it enjoyable. And there's a lot of really interesting examples and theories in the book that you can derive a lot from, and it may nurture a new perspective on those decades and how it influenced a lot of modern thinking. So again, remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.